It's such an honor to be here, and it's such a privilege. It has been a tremendously fun evening watching all of your presentations as well. I want to start with two questions that I think show some of the positive opportunity of some of the difficult threats we've seen. First, if you care a lot about the arts and you want to fund the arts, what do you think is the best way you can get involved, the way to give the most money to the arts? What entity gave the most money to the arts in the world last year? I'm sorry, I actually don't have simultaneous translation up here, I'm realizing, so this is a bad idea. Let me just tell you, it was Kickstarter. Kickstarter gave more money to the arts last year than any other organization. Second question, if you cared about international development, where would you have put your money? Would you have given it to USAID or the Israeli Ministry of Development that we heard about earlier, or the World Bank? That wouldn't have been where the smart money was, because remittances, individual to individual, were the biggest source of international development last year by far. Distributed world, that's one of the things that we're hearing from all the speakers, and it's the theme of my talk too. You're going to hear a lot of similarities between my talk and things that the other speakers have said, because the world we're living in today, the 21st century world that I'm here to talk to you about, is really a new one, but it's a new one with similarities between all these different issues that we've been hearing about. So I've got 3 points to my talk today. The first is, what is national security? What are we trying to protect here when we talk about national security? The second, what are the threats and vulnerabilities we face? And the third, what powers can we use to protect ourselves against those threats and vulnerabilities? So the first, what is national security? Here I'm going to go into a little history lesson that is very modern and constant today. Back in early days of human time, national security was really the protection of the clan. It was the protection of the extended family, a DNA-connected unit that was large. This is back when David was fighting Goliath. And fighting for your national security meant physically protecting other members of your extended family, and still does in many places. Fast forward slightly, you get organized human society and you start having monarchs and chieftains. And suddenly national security shifts greatly. Suddenly protecting the nation does not mean protecting a group of people you're related to. It really means protecting the regime, protecting the monarch or the chieftain. The people are much less important, and territory is mixed. Perhaps there's territory you're protecting, perhaps not. Now, all of these things that exist in time exist right now. So there are monarchies that we can see very close to Israel. There are regimes like North Korea that still are based in that kind of security. Fast forward a little bit further, and you get monarchies using religion as a way of protecting themselves. So you get religious states, Christendom, the Islamic areas, and what they're protecting is a faith group. This might sound quite familiar with Sunni and Shia fighting that's going on right now, traversing the Middle East. You're protecting your religious group. It crosses territory. It crosses boundaries. Ethnic nationalism was the next kind of national security we got. And this was some sort of imagined state, some sort of imagined community. And I use that in a non-pejorative way, simply that various ethnicities came to see themselves as connected, back to sort of that DNA clan in some way. And suddenly national security is about protecting this group of people with whom you have fellow feeling for one reason or another. And that group of people, that fellow feeling, I should say, is worth more than the lives of any individual person. And it, again, crosses territory. So people are martyring themselves and dying for religion. They're martyring themselves and dying for ethno-nationalist national security. Now, some states came up with the idea of being a state based on an idea. This is things like France with its fraternité and égalité. America is another state based on an idea. And suddenly protecting the nation, paradoxically, might mean giving up some security for that idea. So you get open states like America that say it's worth being innocent until proven guilty, even though that ensures that you'll get a certain amount of crime and insecurity in your state, because protecting the idea of the state as a liberal state, humanitarian state, is worth more than actual security. It's kind of crazy. It turns itself inside out a little bit. And then you get the responsibility to protect, which is one of the newer ideas of national security, which is that the nation and its borders don't matter at all. The only entity with moral weight is the individual, is the person. Now, all of these ideas of national security are currently existing right next to each other today. This is not actually a historical continuum. They're all there. You can point to states that are regime-based states. You can point to clan-based states and personal tribe-based states. You can point to religious groups like Sunni and Shia, that are fighting one another, and you can point to ethnic national states. And I would say one challenge that Israel is facing right now is what is its definition of national security? Because the trope that you often hear, and I should start with saying, I love Israel, and I'm really excited to be here. The trope that you often hear in Israel is that it is a liberal, democratic Jewish state. But that center does not hold. With the demographic realities coming up, that center will not continue to hold. And so Israel is going to have to decide. And I'm going to let that hang for a minute there, because I think that decision point is immensely important. I care a huge amount about this state. I have been coming here for many years, but it's been a long hiatus. The last time I was here was right on the eve of the Second Intifada. And being a woman from America who looks very Jewish, I'm constantly reminded of the fact that I am Jewish and that this is not always the most secure thing to be in all of the places I travel to and go to. I've been bothered about it in Indonesia. I've been bothered about it in northern India and Romania, which is where I was on 9/11. And I think that the state finding its founding security purpose, reimagining it, and taking it in hand is incredibly important for the world and certainly for Israel. So what is national security? Second, what are the threats we're facing? What are the vulnerabilities? Well, it's very obvious that Israel faces a state-based threat. Iran is right around the corner, and we talk about it frequently in America as well. Iran is a state-based threat that is a traditional threat, but it is in fact a fairly unusual threat nowadays. Most wars are not fought state to state. Conventional wars state to state are really on the decline, immensely on the decline. Most wars are now fought between less conventional actors. And of course, there's a whole flotilla of groups that are non-conventional. And let's start with the flotilla. This is a much more common threat that Israel might face and has faced. This was Hamas, obviously a terrorist group, but not alone. This was not acting alone. It was Hamas with a bunch of diplomats and peaceniks and well-meaning and intentioned people who were acting really as human shields, whether they knew it or not, for this other group. Now that is a hard threat to face, as Israel found. Very difficult, much more common. We're going to have more and more non-state-based threats that fuse with the state, like Hezbollah and Hamas, where they take on certain state-based powers that make it very difficult for other states to know what to do because you're dealing with a kind of semi-state. You're going to have more lone wolves. We saw the gun demonstration here. We just had a lone wolf attack in America with the Boston Marathon, and of course in London with the cleaver. These are going to get more and more common. They're already common. And of course you're going to have lots of weaker and weaker states. Libya, Mali, Yemen. As these states are getting weaker, the non-state threats are getting stronger. So Bob Gates, our former Secretary of Defense, commented that Hezbollah is now stronger than many states. This goes without saying. It's a non-state actor, stronger than many states. You also get states that look strong, but are in fact weak. And we just saw that with the Arab revolutions. Huge numbers of states, or not huge numbers, but significant numbers of states that look very strong. They're strong autocracies, but in fact, they're brittle on the inside. They're weak on the inside. When I've talked about them before, I say it looks like they're at a static equilibrium. It looks like they're resting the way a pen would rest on its side. But in fact, they're at a static equilibrium like a pen resting on its bottom. It's a very weak static equilibrium, and something tosses it over, and suddenly you see that there's not a lot of there. Now, who takes advantage when the state is weak? Societies take advantage, but not every part of society. Not the lovely liberal revolutionaries that we saw. Organized parts of society take advantage when states are weak. Organized parts of society tend to have a reason to be organized. They tend to be religious groups. They tend to be very organized. Super empowered NGOs, which are basically terrorist groups. And organized groups like the Muslim Brotherhood, like Al-Qaeda, who have figured out how to use networks to organize. And this gets to the nature of power now. One of the things that you've heard over and over and over in the discussions today is that there's disruptive innovation going on in the national security space. Power used to be in the 20th century consolidated. We figured out how to build big corporations. We figured out how to build highly functioning states that were consolidated as single entities and worked together with different parts that did different things and all came together under a single head with pyramid-like hierarchy. That was 20th century organization, and it has increased the wealth of the world vastly and the power of the world vastly. But now it's the 21st century, and what we're seeing is the network and the rise of the network, whether that's Al-Qaeda or the way Google is organized or the way McKinsey is organized. You see more and more small groups that come together, that separate, that do have a head, they're not headless, but can function without a head. It's more and more the way the US military is starting to organize itself with super empowered corporals and super empowered lower and lower levels, because what we found is fighting a network requires a network. More and more disruptive innovation. Now, how do you target that kind of disruptive innovation here in Israel? Well, there's been two main pillars of Israeli defense for many, many years. One is the military, an incredibly strong military, and two is the alliance with America, which has been a deep alliance on many, many levels that has worked really, really well. Unfortunately, these new threats are targeting both sides of that. So let's first look at the military force. Military force is incredibly necessary against many, many threats, and I'm going to talk later about why it is so necessary, but don't think that I'm arguing against military force. I'm not. Extremely necessary. The problem is military force against insurgent threats, because these are a different kind of threat, and what the force tends to do is backfire upon itself. So take that flotilla with all those cell phone carrying, Facebook tweeting, picturing type people on it. What happened? Force is used. Immediately you get pictures up, you get a story framed, you get people saying, here's what happened. While Israel is trying to get its story out, while Israel is sending a message up and back down, while Israel's still fighting, the people on the boat are shaping that story. Incredibly dangerous, because what is a terrorist organization? It's basically a nonprofit organization. It's basically getting funds and volunteers from one place and deploying them somewhere else. What fuels that? Press and public opinion fuels both its volunteer base and its monetary base. So press is to most terrorist organizations the way the mint is to most states. And when we give terrorist organizations positive press of that sort, we're helping them get their volunteers and we're helping them get their money, which is what they need to continue fighting. And so the use of force tends to backfire directly against us. And what was that story they were putting out? The story was Israel as Britain fighting Gandhi. The story was Israel as the US National Guard turning its hoses on the civil rights activists. It's not the story Israel wants out. It's not the true story of Israel, but it is the story that got broadcast to the world. And it's the story that lots and lots of people then take and say, well, how do we want to treat this state? And that causes harm to Israel, of course. Now, as I was saying, I'm not saying give up force. There's immense uses of force. The Osiris reactor, the Syrian reactor, bombing the Hezbollah weapons shipment that just came through, the Arab states that have fought multiple times. However, force is not the only thing that's needed. We need more tools. More and more wars are asymmetric, and more wars are being won by the weaker side. A Harvard study was done that said since from 1950 to 1998, 55% of wars were won by the weaker side. Since 98, that number has increased. Now, asymmetric wars are different kind of wars. None of these wars are being won by an existential threat. None of these wars are being won by crushing the country that they're fighting. This is not the Soviet Union with thousands of missiles pointed toward another country. These are wars that are being fought by turning a country against itself. These are wars that are being fought by slowing an economy to the point where the economy is not functioning for the state. They're wars that are being fought by the slow spiritual attrition of an enemy until someone pulls out. The US has just fought a war similar to this in Afghanistan. It's cost us trillions of dollars, affected our economy greatly, and ultimately probably not gained us a huge amount of security. Israel only has 8 million people. There's a lot more to lose. Now, when I say these kind of wars are dangerous, they're dangerous in part because they threaten the second pillar of Israel's security, America, and our friendship and alliance with Israel. Now, that's a deep alliance. That's not going anywhere anytime soon. But if you look at polling data, the American Jewish population is getting assimilated, just like Generation Y everywhere. They're getting assimilated and they're feeling less connection to Israel. Now, ultimately, that might not matter a whole lot because we're actually a very small percentage, we Jews, of the American population. And we don't matter all that much in terms of votes. But as the Jews are getting assimilated, the evangelicals, who are the other good friend of Israel, are becoming more Latino. And as the evangelical population becomes more Latino, they have ties to other parts of the world. Now, of course, that's not an alliance that's built just on friendship. It's built on real hard security interests, and those security interests have increased since the Arab revolutions. We have more and more weak states. We have fewer friends in the region. We have a deep need to connect with Israel on a lot of very hard security national interest reasons. But America's a global power. Asia has a couple billion people. The Middle East has about 300 million. There's an interest in rebalancing. There's an interest in moving away from an energy economy based on oil. There's an interest in moving to a place that is not mired, not out of the Middle East at all. We'll always be here and we'll always be connected to Israel, but in giving ourselves more room to pivot in different directions, because our enemies are too pivoting in different directions. You have Al-Qaeda popping up in Yemen and Mali and Nigeria and different places, and we can't get too stuck in any one if we're going to fight all these different forces. So what does that mean for Israel? That paints a very worrisome picture. And I think it comes back to what are we protecting and how are we protecting it? As Israel decides what its national security is, what its goal is in terms of protecting its nation state, its territory, its ethnicity, a multi-ethnic group of people, a multi-religious group of people, or a single group or a single religion, it will affect, to some degree, how its alliances work. Not just its alliance with America, but its alliance with many countries. It will also affect the spiritual growth of Israel itself. How its own country, how its own young people are feeling. Those numbers on depression that were given earlier in the evening were quite stunning. Quite stunning. This is a country that is the startup nation, is the country that can do so much for the world and is doing so much for the world technologically and in so many other ways. What would it be like to not be living under a security cloud? To not be living under so much of a security cloud? The good news is there's a great deal Israel can do. And there's a great deal of tools that Israel's already developing. Israel's already leading the world in tech. And that's a good thing because tech is super empowering the bad guys, but it can also super empower the good guys. 3D printing, all of these things that bring down the cost of technology, that make it so cheap for Al-Qaeda to launch its attacks and so expensive for us to fight back, are also bringing things like Stuxnet and the Iron Dome. Technology is a clear winner for Israel. More tools like development. Someone spoke on development earlier today. Incredible tool that Israel has not even begun to develop for itself, has not even begun to give to the rest of the world. But there are a lot of people who could be looking to Israel for that and changing that delegitimization that so many enemies are trying to do to this state. And finally, taking the liberal democratic character of Israel, the humanitarian character of Israel, that Generation Y really is representing quite deeply, and showing it to the world through new media, through Facebook, through social media, through all the different types of ways in which Generation Y is mobilizing itself, is valuable. Because storytelling is what people remember. And storytelling about a state like Israel is an incredibly powerful tool, a military weapon that can be used to reshape how other countries, America and other allies, work with Israel. Now, I'm very optimistic about this. I don't mean to sound pessimistic as the ending speaker of a long day of interesting talks. I'm very optimistic about this because First of all, Israel has pulled itself up by its bootstraps generation after generation. And this generation is going to be no different. And second of all, I'm inspired by the talks that happened earlier today, which were some of the smartest I've ever seen. And I go to a lot of talks like this in America and in other countries around the world. So this is a generation that can do it. And it's worth remembering what people of Generation Y have done in years before. I'm 37, so I'm actually part of Generation XY, which is probably embarrassing to admit, but it's true. But by the time he was my age, Jesus was dead. And he'd already started a major religion. Alexander the Great was dead too. They both died at 33. Most of the founding fathers of America had already created the Constitution. Most of them were under 40, the majority. There are amazing things that Generation Y can do, particularly when harnessed to these super empowered tools that the bad guys are using. And I'm excited to be here with you, and I'm excited to pass on the torch to this whole generation and see what Israel does for its national security and for the good of the world. So thank you very much.